The housekeeper looked me straight in the eye and said, "You won't last a week here." Those were the first words anyone spoke to me when I arrived at Blackwood Manor, and somehow, they stayed with me longer than the cold October wind cutting through my thin jacket. I stood at the bottom of the stone staircase, gripping the handle of my suitcase, staring up at the largest house I had ever seen in my life. House wasn't even the right word. The place looked like something out of a movie. Massive white columns stretched toward the gray morning sky. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the clouds rolling over the Hudson Valley. Luxury cars lined the circular driveway like polished sculptures. Everything about the estate whispered money. Old money. The kind that didn't need to impress anyone because it already owned the room. Or the city. Or maybe the world. I swallowed hard and adjusted the strap of my purse. At 24 years old, I had cleaned apartments, restaurants, office buildings, and vacation rentals. But I had never worked anywhere like this. "Are you listening?" the housekeeper asked sharply. I blinked. "Yes, ma'am." Her name was Margaret Collins. She looked to be in her 60s, with silver hair pulled into a flawless bun and the kind of posture that made military officers seem relaxed. "Good," she said, "because this house has standards. People either meet them or they leave." Her eyes traveled over my worn suitcase, my discount store shoes, and my borrowed coat. Usually very quickly. I forced a polite smile even though my cheeks burned. I needed this job too badly to argue. 3 months earlier, my father's medical bills had drained what little savings I had. Since then, every paycheck seemed to disappear before it even reached my bank account. Rent, groceries, prescriptions, utilities. Life had become a constant exercise in choosing which problem to solve first. When I saw the opening at Blackwood Manor, I applied immediately. The salary was nearly double what I had been earning. The benefits were better. The housing was included. It felt too good to be true. Maybe it was. Margaret led me through enormous front doors that looked older than my entire hometown. Warm air wrapped around me immediately. The marble floor gleamed beneath crystal chandeliers. Fresh flowers filled the entrance hall. Somewhere in the distance, a grandfather clock chimed 10 times. Every sound echoed softly through the mansion. "Your responsibilities begin at 6 every morning," Margaret said as we walked. "You'll assist with guest suites, dining areas, and the East Wing." East Wing. The fact that the house had wings felt ridiculous. "Most importantly," she continued, "you will stay out of Mr. Blackwood's way." I looked up. "Mr. Blackwood?" She stopped walking. For the first time, something unreadable crossed her face. Not fear exactly. Respect maybe. Caution. Ethan Blackwood owns this estate. Even I recognized the name. Everyone did. Billionaire. Business magazines. Television interviews. The face of one of the largest investment companies in America. The kind of man people described as brilliant, demanding, and impossible to know. "He values efficiency," Margaret said carefully. "Do your work well, and you'll never have a problem." Before I could answer, a sudden silence swept through the hallway. It happened so quickly I almost missed it. Conversations stopped. Footsteps paused. Staff members straightened their posture. The atmosphere itself seemed to change. Then I heard the sound of approaching footsteps. Slow, confident, deliberate. Margaret's expression tightened. "Speak of the devil," she murmured. I turned toward the staircase. And for the first time in my life, I came face to face with Ethan Blackwood. I could not explain it then, but the moment Ethan Blackwood appeared at the top of that staircase, the entire house seemed to stop breathing. He descended slowly, one hand resting lightly on the polished railing. Tall, perfectly tailored charcoal suit. Dark hair brushed back from a face that looked like it belonged on the cover of a business magazine. Yet none of that was what caught my attention. It was the silence around him. Every employee we passed had straightened instinctively. Conversations disappeared. Even the distant clatter from the kitchen seemed to fade. I had seen wealthy people before. I had worked for wealthy people before. But this felt different. This felt like standing near the center of gravity itself. Ethan's eyes moved across the foyer, taking everything in without appearing to look at anything directly. Sharp blue-gray eyes. Calm. Controlled. The kind of eyes that noticed details other people missed. For one brief second, his gaze landed on me. My stomach tightened. Not because he looked angry. Not because he looked cold. Because he looked completely unreadable. As if he could solve a complicated equation faster than he could decide whether a person mattered. Then he looked away and continued walking. Just like that. No introduction. No acknowledgement. No welcome. Nothing. The front door opened. A driver hurried forward. Ethan accepted a leather portfolio from one of his assistants and left without speaking another word. The heavy doors closed behind him. The tension disappeared almost immediately. Several employees released quiet breaths. One maid beside me actually placed a hand over her chest. Margaret resumed walking. "You are fortunate," she said. "Fortunate?" I asked. He barely looked at me. Exactly. Her answer made no sense at the time. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of instructions. Storage rooms, cleaning schedules, guest suites larger than most apartments I had lived in. By lunchtime, my feet already ached. By 3 o'clock, I was carrying fresh linens through the west corridor when I noticed an older groundskeeper struggling with a large cart filled with potted plants. One wheel had become stuck in the edge of a stone pathway. Several employees walked past without stopping. They were busy. Everyone here always seemed busy. The man wiped sweat from his forehead and tried again. The cart refused to move. I set down my linens and walked over. "Need a hand?" I asked. His surprised smile deepened the wrinkles around his eyes. "I would appreciate that." Together we managed to free the wheel. It only took a minute. Maybe 2. "Thank you," he said. "Most people pretend they do not see me anymore." "I see you," I replied. The words came out before I thought about them. Something changed in his expression. Not sadness. Gratitude. Real gratitude. We exchanged names. His was Walter. He had worked on the estate for nearly 20 years. As I picked up my linens again, I felt strangely lighter. Maybe because kindness cost nothing. Maybe because it reminded me of my father before he became sick. What I did not know was that someone had been watching the entire interaction from the second-floor balcony above us. And later that evening, as the sun disappeared behind the hills surrounding Blackwood Manor, Ethan Blackwood asked Margaret a question about the new maid. A question that would change everything. Who is Grace Miller? The next morning began before sunrise. The sky outside my small staff room was still dark blue when my alarm pulled me awake at 5 o'clock. For a few seconds, I forgot where I was. Then I saw the neatly folded uniform hanging beside the closet and remembered Blackwood Manor. Remembered Margaret. Remembered Ethan Blackwood. And remembered the strange question he had apparently asked about me. Who is Grace Miller? I told myself it did not matter. People like Ethan Blackwood probably asked questions about dozens of employees every week. By 6 o'clock, I was already working. The mansion slowly came alive around me. Coffee brewed somewhere downstairs. Deliveries arrived at the service entrance. Gardeners prepared the grounds. Assistants moved through hallways carrying tablets and folders. Everything operated with quiet precision. Around 10 that morning, Margaret handed me a silver tray holding a coffee cup and several documents. Her expression looked unusually serious. "Take these to Mr. Blackwood's office." I nearly dropped the tray. "Me?" "Yes, you." She glanced at her watch. "And do not keep him waiting." My pulse immediately accelerated. The office occupied an entire corner of the second floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked acres of autumn-colored trees stretching toward the horizon. I stood outside the double doors for a moment, balancing the tray carefully before knocking twice. "Come in." His voice was calm and deep. I pushed the door open. The office was somehow even more intimidating than the rest of the mansion. Dark wood shelves lined the walls. Modern artwork hung between them. Sunlight streamed across polished floors. At the far end of the room sat Ethan Blackwood behind a massive desk. He was reading something on a tablet without looking up. "Your coffee, sir." I walked forward carefully. Unfortunately, that was exactly when disaster struck. One corner of a rug caught the tip of my shoe. Not enough to make me fall, just enough to throw off my balance. The tray tilted. My heart stopped. A few drops of coffee splashed directly onto the edge of a document resting on his desk. Silence. Complete silence. I stared at the dark stain spreading across the paper. Every terrible possibility rushed through my mind at once. I had worked here less than 48 hours. I was definitely getting fired. "I am so sorry," I blurted out. "I can clean that. I should have been paying better attention. I did not mean to." Ethan finally looked up. Those blue-gray eyes met mine. Calm. Unreadable. "Are you injured?" I blinked. "What?" "You nearly fell." I stared at him. Of all the responses I had expected, that was not one of them. "No, sir." His gaze briefly moved to the spilled coffee. Then back to me. "Good." He picked up another copy of the document from a stack beside him. "Accidents happen. For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood. Surely a billionaire running a multi-billion-dollar company would care more about important paperwork than a clumsy maid. Yet he sounded completely sincere. Relief washed through me, so suddenly my knees felt weak. Thank you. I turned to leave as quickly as possible before my luck changed. Then his voice stopped me. Grace. Hearing my name on his lips felt strangely unexpected. I looked back. Ethan leaned slightly against his chair, studying me with quiet curiosity. Why did you stop to help Walter yesterday when everyone else walked by? My breath caught, and somehow, I knew this conversation was only the beginning. For a moment, I just stood there staring at him. Out of all the questions a billionaire could ask, that was the last one I expected. Why did you stop to help Walter yesterday when everyone else walked by? His voice remained calm, curious, not judgmental, just genuinely interested. I shifted my weight slightly, still holding the empty tray against my chest. Because he needed help. Ethan continued watching me. That's simple. I nodded. Yes, sir. A faint crease appeared between his eyebrows, almost as if he was searching for a more complicated answer. You were already behind schedule. Probably. And helping him offered you no advantage. I could not stop a small smile. Not everything has to. The silence that followed felt different from the others we had shared. Not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. Sunlight poured through the massive windows behind him, painting long golden reflections across the polished floor. For the first time, Ethan looked less like a billionaire and more like a man trying to understand something that did not fit into one of his spreadsheets. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. You can go, Grace. Thank you, sir. I left the office before my nerves could catch up with me. The moment the doors closed behind me, I released a breath I had not realized I was holding. The rest of the day passed quickly. Rooms to clean, deliveries to organize, endless tasks that kept my hands busy and my thoughts occupied. Yet every now and then, I caught myself replaying that conversation. Not because of what Ethan had said, because of how he had listened. Most wealthy people I had worked around enjoyed talking. Ethan seemed more interested in observing. 3 days later, another unexpected encounter happened. I was dusting shelves in one of the private sitting rooms when I noticed something unusual tucked behind a row of books. A small silver pocket watch. The metal surface was scratched from years of use. Curious, I picked it up carefully. The watch felt heavier than it looked. Old, valuable, personal. Before I could return it to the shelf, a voice behind me made me freeze. Where did you find that? I turned too quickly. Ethan stood in the doorway. My heart nearly stopped. I am sorry. I was cleaning and found it behind the books. His eyes immediately dropped to the watch in my hands. For the first time since meeting him, his expression changed completely. The calm confidence disappeared. Not dramatically, just enough for me to notice. Something softer replaced it. Something almost sad. He walked across the room and held out his hand. I placed the watch in his palm. His fingers closed around it immediately. It belonged to my father, he said quietly. I had never heard him mention family before. It is beautiful, I replied. Ethan looked down at the worn silver surface. It stopped working years ago. Then why keep it? The question escaped before I could stop myself. His eyes lifted toward mine. For a second, I worried I had crossed a line. Instead, something unexpected happened. The corner of his mouth moved slightly. Not quite a smile, but close. Because some things matter even after they stop working. The answer stayed with me long after he left the room. And later that night, as rain tapped softly against my window, I found myself wondering if he had been talking about the watch at all. The invitation arrived on a Thursday afternoon. I was folding freshly pressed towels in the laundry room when Margaret appeared beside me holding a cream-colored envelope. She extended it without explanation. Mr. Blackwood requested your presence at dinner tonight. I nearly dropped the stack in my hands. Dinner? Margaret nodded once. In the formal dining room. 7 o'clock sharp. Before I could ask another question, she walked away. For the next several hours, I convinced myself there had been some mistake. Employees did not have dinner with billionaires. Maid certainly did not. Yet at exactly 6:55 that evening, I found myself standing outside the formal dining room, trying to slow my heartbeat. The room looked like something from another century. A crystal chandelier glowed overhead. Tall windows reflected the darkness outside. Candles flickered across a table long enough to seat 20 people. Yet only 2 places had been set, one at each end. Ethan was already there. He stood near the windows holding a glass of sparkling water. When he noticed me, He gestured toward the table. Thank you for coming. I sat carefully, still uncertain why I was there. Thank you for inviting me. The chef served dinner. Roasted salmon, seasonal vegetables, fresh bread, food far nicer than anything I usually ate. For several minutes, neither of us spoke much. Surprisingly, the silence did not feel uncomfortable. Eventually, Ethan set down his fork. How are you settling in? I almost laughed. Are you asking as my employer? A faint smile touched his face. Should I be? Probably. His smile grew slightly wider. It transformed his entire appearance. Not dramatically, just enough to reveal the man hidden beneath the reputation. The conversation slowly became easier after that. We talked about small things at first. The estate, the changing leaves outside, Walter's garden. Then somehow we ended up discussing childhood memories, favorite books, places we wanted to visit. For the first time, I forgot who he was supposed to be. Not Ethan Blackwood, the billionaire. Just Ethan, a man sitting across from me sharing a meal. Halfway through dessert, one of the servers accidentally dropped a tray near the doorway. The crash echoed through the room. The young employee immediately froze. Panic spread across his face. I recognized the expression. Fear of making a mistake. Fear of losing something important. Before anyone else could react, Ethan calmly stood. Are you all right? The young man blinked. Yes, sir. Good. Then let us clean it up and move on. Relief flooded the employee's face. The tension disappeared from the room. Ethan returned to his seat as though nothing unusual had happened. I studied him quietly. What? He asked. Nothing. That is not true. I hesitated. People seem afraid of disappointing you. His gaze drifted toward the shattered glass being cleaned near the doorway. Perhaps they should not be. There was something unexpectedly lonely in the way he said it. The dinner ended an hour later. As I walked back toward the staff wing, I realized something had changed. Not because a billionaire had invited me to dinner. Not because the mansion suddenly felt smaller. Something deeper. For the first time since arriving at Blackwood Manor, Ethan Blackwood no longer felt like a distant figure standing at the top of a staircase. He felt human, and somehow, that realization was far more dangerous. 3 days after the dinner, I found an envelope waiting on the small desk inside my room. At first, I assumed it was another work schedule or a housekeeping memo. Then I saw my name written neatly across the front. Grace Miller. My stomach tightened. Nobody ever wrote letters to me anymore. I opened it carefully. Inside was a check. A very large check. For a moment, I thought there had to be some mistake. Then I noticed the note attached beneath it. For your father's medical expenses. No repayment necessary. The signature at the bottom consisted of 2 simple words. Ethan Blackwood. I sat down immediately. The room suddenly felt smaller. Quieter. My heart pounded against my ribs. The amount written on the check was more money than I usually earned in months. Enough to eliminate several outstanding bills. Enough to let me sleep through the night without calculating expenses in my head. Enough to change everything. I stared at it for a long time. Then I folded it carefully, placed it back into the envelope, and stood up. 20 minutes later, I was outside Ethan's office. I knocked twice. Come in. He looked up from his laptop as I entered. His expression remained calm until he noticed the envelope in my hand. Then something shifted behind his eyes. Not surprise. Recognition. I cannot accept this, I said. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Why not? Because it is too much. Your father needs treatment. The directness of his answer caught me off guard. How do you even know about that? He was silent for a moment. You mentioned medical bills during dinner. I remembered now. Briefly. Casually. I had not expected him to remember. That does not mean you should pay them. It means I can help. I did not ask for help. The room became very quiet. Ethan studied me for several seconds. Most people seemed eager to agree with him, to accept whatever solution he offered. I was not trying to challenge him. I simply could not take something I had not earned. Finally, he stood and walked toward the windows overlooking the estate. Autumn sunlight painted golden streaks across the glass. Do you know what most people ask me for? He said quietly. Money, access, favors, opportunities. I tightened my grip on the envelope. And you are the first person who has ever handed it back. I did not know what to say to that. Ethan turned toward me. There was no frustration in his expression, no anger, only curiosity. The same curiosity I had seen since the day he asked about Walter. Grace, why is accepting kindness harder for you than working yourself into exhaustion? The question landed deeper than I wanted it to. Because the truth was simple. When you grow up counting every dollar, nothing feels free. Every gift carries weight. Every favor creates debt. I looked down at the envelope, then back at him. Because I need to know I can stand on my own. Ethan held my gaze. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then something unexpected happened. He smiled. Not the polite smile from dinner. A real one. Small. Genuine. That, he said softly, might be my favorite thing about you. After that conversation, something changed between us. Not all at once. Not in a way anyone else would immediately notice. But I felt it. The following week, Ethan seemed to appear everywhere. Not intentionally. At least that was what I told myself. I would be arranging flowers in the library and find him working at a nearby table. I would be organizing books in a sitting room and discover him reading reports by the fireplace. Sometimes we exchanged only a few words. Sometimes none at all. Yet the silence felt different now. Comfortable. Familiar. One rainy evening, I was carrying fresh linens through the west wing when I noticed a light glowing beneath a partially open door. Most of the mansion had already settled into quiet. Curious, I glanced inside. Ethan sat alone in a leather chair near the window. The room was dark except for a single lamp beside him. Papers covered the desk. His jacket had been tossed across a nearby sofa. For the first time since meeting him, he looked tired. Not physically, emotionally. The kind of exhaustion that sleep could not fix. I should have kept walking. Instead, I knocked softly against the doorframe. Ethan looked up. Grace. His voice sounded distant. I did not realize anyone was still awake. I stepped inside. Neither did I. A faint smile appeared and disappeared. Rain tapped gently against the glass. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old books. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then my eyes drifted toward a framed photograph resting on a shelf behind him. A younger Ethan stood beside an older man. Both were smiling. The older man's hand rested proudly on his son's shoulder. I recognized him immediately. Ethan's father, the owner of the silver pocket watch. Ethan followed my gaze. His expression changed. The same quiet sadness I had seen when he held the watch. He built this company, Ethan said softly. Every building, every investment, every opportunity. I listened. People think inheriting success makes life easier. He looked toward the rain outside. Sometimes it only gives you more ways to disappoint the people you love. The honesty in his voice caught me off guard. Billionaires were supposed to be confident, untouchable, certain, yet sitting there beneath the soft light. Ethan looked nothing like the man from magazine covers. He looked human. You loved him very much, I said. Ethan nodded once. And I spent years trying to become him. Silence settled between us. Then I asked the question that had been lingering in my mind for weeks. Did you ever succeed? His eyes met mine. For a second, I worried I had crossed another line. Then something unexpected happened. Ethan laughed quietly. Not a loud laugh. Not even a happy one. Just honest. No. The answer surprised me. Why not? He leaned back slightly. Because my father knew how to be present. I only learned how to be productive. The words stayed in the air long after he said them. I did not know how to fix that kind of loneliness. So I did the only thing I could. I stayed. We sat there listening to the rain for nearly 20 minutes. No business discussions. No schedules. No expectations. Just two people sharing a quiet room. And when I finally stood to leave, Ethan looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not curiosity. Not admiration. Something deeper. Something that made my heart stumble. Thank you for staying, Grace, he said. And somehow, those 4 words felt more valuable than any check he could have ever written. The call came just after midnight. I had been asleep for less than an hour when someone knocked urgently on my door. The sound pulled me upright immediately. My heart raced as I opened the door and found Margaret standing in the hallway. Even in the dim light, I could see concern written across her face. Grace, I need your help. I followed her through the quiet mansion without asking questions. Something felt wrong. The house seemed different. Tense. The farther we walked, the quieter everything became. Finally, we stopped outside Ethan's private office. The door was partially open. Margaret lowered her voice. He has been in there for hours. Working? I asked. She hesitated. Not exactly. Then she left. I stood alone outside the doorway. For several seconds, I debated whether I should enter at all. Then I heard something inside. Not a conversation. Not movement. Silence. The heavy kind. The kind that feels wrong. I gently pushed the door open. Ethan sat behind his desk staring at the city lights visible through the distant windows. His laptop remained open. Multiple screens glowed around the room. Financial reports covered every surface. Yet he was not looking at any of them. He looked exhausted. More exhausted than I had ever seen him. His tie hung loose around his neck. His sleeves were rolled up. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. Ethan. His gaze shifted toward me slowly. Grace. His voice sounded distant. What are you doing awake? I could ask you the same thing. A faint smile appeared and disappeared. Long day. I stepped farther into the room. Margaret seems worried. He looked away. Margaret worries about everything. Normally I would have laughed. Tonight I did not. Something underneath his calm exterior felt fragile. Not weak. Just stretched too thin. I noticed several news articles displayed on one of the monitors. Headlines. Market losses. Failed negotiations. Public criticism. The kind of problems that followed powerful people everywhere. Did something happen? I asked quietly. Ethan remained silent for a long moment. Then he exhaled slowly. Have you ever spent years building something only to watch it start falling apart? The question surprised me. Yes. His eyes met mine. You have. I nodded. My family. The room became still. Ethan looked down at his hands. Today, 3 major investors withdrew from a project my company has spent 2 years developing. His voice remained calm, but I could hear the disappointment beneath it. Everyone expects answers. Everyone expects certainty. And honestly, Grace. He stopped. For the first time since I had met him, he looked lost. I do not know what comes next. The confession hung in the air between us. I walked toward the desk and sat in the chair across from him. Then maybe tonight you do not need answers. He frowned slightly. What? Maybe tonight you just need a break. Ethan stared at me. Then something remarkable happened. His shoulders relaxed. Just a little. As though he had been carrying a weight for so long he forgot it could be set down. We talked for nearly an hour. Not about investors. Not about business. About ordinary things. Childhood memories. Favorite movies. Walter's Impossible Roses. The first jobs we ever had. Slowly the tension left his face. The exhaustion remained, but the loneliness faded. When the grandfather clock finally struck 2 in the morning, Ethan looked at me differently than he ever had before. Softer. Warmer. Almost grateful. You know, he said quietly. Everyone always expects me to fix things. I smiled. And tonight. His eyes held mine. Tonight you fixed me. The next few days felt strangely different. Nothing obvious changed. I still cleaned rooms. I still followed schedules. Ethan still ran one of the largest companies in the country. Yet somehow the distance between us had become smaller. It showed up in little moments. A brief conversation in the hallway. A shared cup of coffee in the library. A glance across a crowded room that lingered half a second longer than before. One crisp Saturday afternoon, the estate hosted a small charity event. Local business leaders, donors, and community organizers filled the mansion with polite conversations and practiced smiles. My assignment was simple. Assist the catering staff and make sure the guest areas remained presentable. By early evening, every room seemed full. Laughter drifted through the halls. Crystal glasses reflected warm light from the chandeliers. Everything appeared perfect, until I accidentally overheard a conversation. I was arranging fresh flowers near the ballroom entrance when 2 guests stopped nearby. Neither noticed me. That must be her, one woman whispered. The maid. The other followed her gaze. I expected someone different. Apparently, she spends a lot of time around Ethan. I looked away immediately. Their voices remained low, but not low enough. Strange, is it not? The second woman replied. A man like him usually surrounds himself with people from his own world. My cheeks warmed. I should have walked away. Instead, I focused on the flowers and pretended not to hear another word. A few minutes later, I escaped to the terrace for fresh air. The autumn evening felt cool against my skin. Below, the gardens stretched into darkness. Tiny lights illuminated the pathways like scattered stars. You disappeared. I turned. Ethan stood beside the open terrace door. His tie was slightly loosened. The formal event clearly bored him as much as it bored me. I needed a minute. He stepped outside and joined me near the railing. For a while, neither of us spoke. The sounds of the party remained muted behind the glass. You do not enjoy these events very much, do you? I asked. Ethan laughed softly. Not even a little. Then why host them? He looked out across the grounds. Because sometimes responsibility matters more than preference. I smiled. That sounds exhausting. It is. The answer came immediately. Honest. Unfiltered. We stood there watching the lights below. Somewhere in the distance, a fountain splashed softly. The evening felt peaceful, almost suspended in time. Then Ethan spoke again. Grace. Something in his voice made me look at him. His expression had changed. Serious. Thoughtful. The kind of look that usually appeared before he said something important. You have changed this place. I blinked. I clean rooms. No. He shook his head gently. You remind people they matter. My heart stumbled unexpectedly. For a second, neither of us looked away. The air between us felt different. Not uncomfortable. Not uncertain. Just intensely quiet. Then footsteps approached from inside the ballroom. The moment broke instantly. Ethan stepped back. The terrace door opened. One of his executives appeared. Sorry to interrupt. We need you inside. Ethan nodded. The man disappeared again. Before leaving, Ethan looked at me one last time. There was something in his eyes I had never seen before. Something neither of us seemed ready to name. Enjoy the rest of the evening, Grace. Then he walked back into the crowd. I remained alone on the terrace, listening to the distant music. And for the first time since arriving at Blackwood Manor, I realized the thing I had been trying hardest not to admit. Somewhere along the way, Ethan Blackwood had become far more important to me than he should have. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning. I knew it before anyone said a word. The atmosphere inside Blackwood Manor felt different the moment I stepped into the kitchen. Conversations stopped when I entered. People looked away too quickly. A few employees who normally greeted me suddenly became interested in their coffee cups. The uneasy feeling followed me through the entire morning. By lunchtime, I finally discovered why. My phone buzzed while I was organizing supplies in a storage room. A message from an old friend appeared on the screen. Grace, are you okay? Confused, I opened the link she attached. My stomach dropped instantly. A gossip website displayed a photograph of Ethan and me standing together on the terrace during the charity event. Another showed us laughing near the library several days earlier. The headline stretched across the screen in bold letters. Billionaire CEO's mysterious relationship raises questions. My hands began to tremble. More articles followed. More photographs. More speculation. Some claimed I was secretly dating Ethan. Others suggested I had manipulated my way into his life. A few were even crueler. By the end of the afternoon, the story had spread across social media. Everywhere I looked, strangers seemed convinced they knew who I was. None of them actually did. That evening, I tried to avoid Ethan. I failed. He found me in the greenhouse shortly before sunset. The glass walls glowed orange beneath the fading light. Flowers surrounded us. The air smelled faintly of soil and roses. Ethan walked toward me with a determined expression. Grace. I kept my attention on the plants. You saw it. It was not a question. Yes. Silence settled between us. I am sorry, he said quietly. I looked up immediately. You did not create those stories. No, but I should have anticipated them. For the first time, frustration flickered across his face. Not at me, at himself. This is the part nobody tells you about success. The moment people cannot understand something, they invent explanations. I folded my arms. Most of those explanations paint me as some kind of gold digger. The words tasted awful. Ethan's jaw tightened. They are wrong. That does not stop them from saying it. His eyes met mine. Steady. Certain. Grace, listen to me. Anyone who actually knows you would never believe those things. I wanted to believe him. Part of me did. Yet another part remembered every comment from the charity event. Every whisper. Every glance. The distance between our worlds suddenly felt larger than ever. Ethan stepped closer. Not enough to crowd me. Just enough to make sure I heard him. You once told me you needed to stand on your own. I nodded. You already do. His voice softened. That is why none of this changes who you are. The greenhouse became very quiet. Outside, the sun slipped below the horizon. For a moment, I almost let myself believe everything would be fine. Then my phone buzzed again. Another article. Another rumor. Another reminder that the entire world seemed determined to turn my life into a story. And standing there among the roses, I realized something terrifying. The closer Ethan and I became, the harder it would be to protect either of us from what came next. The decision took 3 sleepless nights. 3 nights of staring at the ceiling in my small room, while headlines continued spreading across the internet. 3 nights of watching employees pretend not to notice the whispers that followed me through the hallways. 3 nights of asking myself the same question. Was I helping Ethan by staying or hurting him? On the 4th morning, I already knew the answer before I admitted it. The estate looked beautiful beneath a pale November sunrise. Frost covered the gardens. The fountains sparkled in the early light. Everything seemed peaceful. Yet inside me, nothing felt peaceful at all. I spent the morning completing my duties with unusual care. Folding linens. Organizing supplies. Finishing every task exactly the way Margaret had taught me. Around noon, I walked through the rose garden one last time. Walter spotted me immediately. "You look like someone carrying a heavy secret," he said. I smiled sadly. "Maybe I am." His expression softened. "Whatever it is, make sure it is your choice." Those words followed me for the rest of the afternoon. By evening, I had packed my suitcase. The same suitcase I had carried up those front steps months earlier. Funny how something so small could suddenly feel so heavy. I left the resignation letter on Margaret's desk. She found me before I could leave. "You are making a mistake," she said quietly. "Maybe." My voice trembled. "But I think it is the right one." For the first time since I had met her, Margaret looked genuinely emotional. "This house has felt different since you arrived." I looked away. That is exactly the problem. Her eyes closed briefly. Neither of us mentioned Ethan's name. We did not need to. At 7 o'clock, I carried my suitcase toward the front entrance. The mansion seemed unusually quiet, almost as though it knew what was happening. My hand had just reached for the door when a familiar voice stopped me. "Where are you going?" Every muscle in my body froze. Slowly, I turned around. Ethan stood at the far end of the foyer. He had clearly come directly from work. His tie was loosened, his expression unreadable. In one hand, he held my resignation letter. Silence filled the enormous room. Grace. My name sounded different coming from him now. More personal, more painful. I forced myself to breathe. "I cannot stay." Ethan walked closer. "Because of the articles? Because of what comes next?" He stopped a few feet away. "And what exactly comes next?" I swallowed hard. "More rumors. More stories. More people questioning your judgment because of me." His eyes never left mine. "I do not care about that." "I do." The words escaped before I could stop them. The truth hung between us. Raw. Honest. Ethan looked down briefly before meeting my gaze again. "So your solution is to leave." "My solution is to stop making your life harder." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan gave a small shake of his head. Not angry. Not frustrated. Heartbroken. The realization hit me, so suddenly it stole my breath. "Grace," he said quietly, "you have never made my life harder." The tears I had spent days holding back finally threatened to surface. I tightened my grip on the suitcase handle. Because if I stayed 1 second longer, I was not sure I would be able to leave at all. The front door closed behind me with a soft click that sounded far louder than it should have. Cold November air wrapped around me immediately. I stood at the bottom of the stone staircase, clutching my suitcase, staring back at the mansion that had somehow become home. Lights glowed from dozens of windows. Somewhere inside, Ethan was still standing in that foyer. Somewhere inside, part of me remained too. The drive away from Blackwood Manor felt unreal. Trees blurred past the window. Small towns appeared and disappeared beneath gray skies. I rented a modest apartment 40 miles away and returned to the life I thought I understood. Smaller rooms, smaller paychecks, simpler expectations. On paper, everything made sense. Yet every morning felt strangely empty. Weeks passed. Winter arrived. Snow-covered sidewalks and rooftops. Life continued, moving forward whether I wanted it to or not. I found work at a local hotel. The staff was kind. The hours were steady. Nobody cared who I was. Nobody whispered when I entered a room. It should have felt like freedom. Instead, it felt like absence. One evening after finishing a shift, I stopped at a small diner near my apartment. The smell of coffee filled the air. Holiday music played softly from hidden speakers. Families laughed in nearby booths. Normal life. Ordinary life. The life I had convinced myself I wanted. Then my phone buzzed. A news notification appeared across the screen. Blackwood Holdings announces major leadership changes. Curious despite myself, I opened the article. My breath caught. Ethan had stepped away from several high-profile boards. Multiple interviews had been canceled. Public appearances dramatically reduced. Analysts seemed confused. Investors were speculating. Nobody understood why, but somehow I did. I remembered the exhaustion in his office, the loneliness behind the success, the pressure he carried every day. For the first time, I wondered if leaving had truly protected him at all. Christmas arrived 2 weeks later. Snow drifted gently outside my apartment window. I spent the morning wrapping a small gift for my father before preparing dinner. Around 6 o'clock, someone knocked on my door. I frowned. I was not expecting visitors. The knock came again. Slow. Certain. My heart began to race for reasons I could not explain. I crossed the room and opened the door. For a second, I forgot how to breathe. Ethan stood on the other side, holding snowflakes on the shoulders of his dark coat. His hair was damp from the weather. His blue-gray eyes met mine immediately. Neither of us spoke. The hallway seemed to disappear. The city disappeared. Everything disappeared. There was only him. Only us. Finally, I found my voice. "How did you find me?" Ethan smiled softly. The same genuine smile I had seen only a handful of times. "Grace, I run an international company." A nervous laugh escaped before I could stop it. Then silence returned. Different this time. Hopeful. Ethan looked at me as though he had crossed an ocean to reach that doorway. Maybe he had. "I spent months trying to convince myself you were right," he said quietly. "About what?" His eyes never left mine. "That losing you was the price of protecting you." Snow continued falling outside. The world remained perfectly still. Ethan took one step forward. "Turns out," he said softly, "it was simply losing you." For a long moment, neither of us moved. Snow drifted quietly through the glow of the streetlights outside my apartment building. Ethan stood in the doorway looking at me as though every mile between us had finally disappeared. I felt tears gathering before I even realized why. Maybe because I had missed him. Maybe because part of me had never truly believed I would see him again. "You came all this way," I whispered. Ethan smiled softly. 40 miles is not very far when the alternative is spending the rest of your life wondering what might have happened. The honesty in his voice took my breath away. I stepped aside and invited him in. My apartment suddenly felt impossibly small compared to Blackwood Manor. A second-hand couch sat against one wall. A tiny Christmas tree glowed in the corner. The scent of cinnamon drifted from the kitchen. Yet Ethan looked around as though he had entered somewhere extraordinary. "It is nice here," he said. I laughed. "You own a mansion, and somehow this feels warmer." We sat together for nearly 2 hours. Talking. Really talking. Not about rumors. Not about headlines. Not about expectations. We talked about everything we had avoided saying. The loneliness after I left. The emptiness I carried. The realization that neither of us had been protecting the other by staying apart. We had simply been hurting separately. At one point, Ethan reached into his coat pocket and removed a small velvet box. My heart stopped. "Before you panic," he said with a nervous smile, "let me explain." I laughed through tears. "That is not helping." He shook his head and opened the box. Inside rested the silver pocket watch. The same watch that had belonged to his father. Carefully restored. Working again. The hands moved smoothly beneath the glass. Tick, tick, tick. Ethan looked down at it briefly before meeting my eyes. "Do you remember what I told you?" I nodded. "Some things matter even after they stop working." I was wrong. His voice softened. "The right people help them work again." Tears slipped down my cheeks. Ethan took a slow breath. Then he did something I never expected from the man who could command boardrooms full of executives without hesitation. He looked nervous. Truly nervous. "Grace Miller," he said quietly, "you walked into my life carrying a suitcase and a stubborn belief that kindness matters. You changed this house. You changed the people in it. Most of all, you changed me." My heart felt too large for my chest. "You taught me that success means very little if there is nobody beside you when you get home. You taught me that people matter more than numbers. And every meaningful thing that has happened to me in the last year somehow begins with you." Snow continued falling beyond the window. The tiny Christmas lights reflected in his eyes. "So I have one question left." He held out his hand. "Will you build a future with me?" I could not even pretend to think about it. I placed my hand in his immediately. "Yes." Ethan laughed with pure relief. I laughed too. And somewhere beyond the city, beyond the headlines, beyond the differences that once seemed impossible to overcome, a new chapter quietly began. Because in the end, he thought I had changed his life. The truth was simpler than that. We saved each other. And sometimes the greatest wealth a person can ever find is not in what they own. It is in who finally makes them feel at home.